Hello and welcome to Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. This is our 26th podcast, 26th episode. It's going to be a short introduction. I just spent an hour talking to a gentleman named Doug Peacock. If you don't know Doug, here are two things that I'll tell you that I believe will intrigue you to stay with us and watch this show. He is a Vietnam veteran. He was a Green Beret. He served 2 tours, and then he came back and he spent 40 years basically living with grizzly bears. Had 30 plus encounters where he was charged by grizzly bears. He has been involved in conservation and publicity and awareness and safety and health for grizzly bears since 1970. It is a fantastic episode. I really hope you enjoy it. Have a great time. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. We've got a fun episode lined up for you today, one that I'm particularly interested in. I've got a lot of questions for the gentleman that we're interviewing, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of his answers. This is Doug Peacock.
Thank you, Scott.
Doug, welcome.
It's a pleasure.
You bet. Now, Doug is many things, but among that list is author, filmmaker, wildlife activist, and absolutely most important, is a Vietnam War veteran. And Doug, I want to say thank you very much for your service.
Thank you, Scott.
I hope you never feel that that's taken for granted, and I certainly don't. And I really do appreciate it. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today as part of the overall conversation and your journey. Doug is a world-renowned expert in grizzly bears, and we're going to talk a lot about grizzly bears and really anything else that Doug wants to talk about. But we're certainly going to talk about grizzly bears. I don't know anybody who has ever taken a walk or stepped outside of their house that isn't fascinated by grizzly bears. There are probably more myths and legends and stories and fears and passion and just about every emotion that can be generated by an animal that comes out of grizzly bears. So I want to start, Doug, by asking, why grizzlies? What got you interested in grizzly bears?
Well, the short story is I came back from Vietnam after 2 tours as a Green Beret medic in the Central Highlands. And when I got back to the States, just wasn't any good with people. And so I went into the one place that I've always been comfortable in my life, and that is wilderness. And whether it's growing up in Michigan or hanging out with grizzlies in British Columbia or the Northern Rockies. Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. That's a phrase I've never heard before. Hanging out with grizzlies.
I went and lived with them.
I get hanging out with my college buddies. I get hanging out with my softball team. You were, after the 2 times through as a Green Beret, you decided to relax and come back and hang out with grizzlies?
It was sort of an accidental first exposure to them. I knew lots about the Rocky Mountains. And I spent a summer in Alaska, but I really didn't know anything about grizzly bears. But the one place where Homo sapiens are not the top dog is grizzly country. What happened to me was I went into the east side of the Wind River Range, which is a very wet, cold, rugged place. And I got a malaria attack, which is, I brought it back with me. And so I wasn't surprised, and I knew it was going to happen because I'd had these paroxysms before. So I got the hell out of the Wind River because it was too rough and the weather was lousy, because I knew I was going to run a high fever. And
where is Wind River? What state are we talking about?
It's okay. The coldest Rocky Mountain chain in the lower 48. It's got lots of glaciers and things like that. So when I got out there, I went into Yellowstone, and because I knew Yellowstone, I'd been there, and I was going to go back in where there's a bunch of hot springs and a hot creek, and you can soak in the hot creek. And I decided that's what I was going to do, sort of soak in the healing waters and get over my malaria attack. And when I was in there, my fever started to go up, and I keep a journal, but I went out of my mind. I had a fever, I think 0.4 was when, I lost my lucidity. And, I remember going outside. I wasn't sure how long I was in my sleeping bag, in my tent in Yellowstone, but I'd go outside to to get water or whatever, and I saw lots of grizzly tracks, or so I thought they were. But I also was hallucinating, so I didn't trust myself. And so these these imagined grizzly bears, once my fever broke and I came back to consciousness, they turned out to be real. And there were grizzlies all over the place in there. And so one day when it really took, one day I was in the same place and I went to soak in a little tiny pool in a tiny creek, but it's hot. And I was soaking in the creek, and it's about November by then. It's pretty late in the year. It's cool, but not snowing yet. And I was smoking this little hole with the hot water running over my neck and shoulders, imagining that I was healing. And I looked out to the side, and across the meadow was a mother grizzly with two yearling cubs. And, I didn't know much about grizzlies then. I just knew you're supposed to avoid, mothers with cubs. So I decided I was going to climb a tree, and then and I'm in a little tiny creek. And so when the bears weren't looking at me, I stood up fast. The whirlpool-like effect of the hot water, I'd been in there for 20, 30 minutes, and I started to pass out. So I was blacking out, but I was still terrified. So there's a tree just a few feet away, a little lodgepole pine, and I went and lunged for it, passed out, hit my forehead, and I had a big slash up here. I'm kind of accident prone anybody. The blood was running down my face, and I was scared to death. So I scrambled up to the top of this lodgepole pine tree. And after a minute, I realized that this pine tree wasn't much bigger than a Christmas tree. It wasn't going to do me much good. Anyway, those bears hung around, came and grazed on a grass, or I don't know what that time of year, but they knew I was there up this tiny little tree, hanging to the top like some kind of species of silly sparrow, and they never paid me any attention. And those bears got my attention. That was the first.
And
That
what year was that?
October of 1968, long time ago. So I've been hanging out with grizzlies, a long time. And shortly thereafter, I became an advocate for grizzlies, and I filmed them with a 16 millimeter camera for almost 20 years. And I'm still working on a final film using that footage right now. So it's a long time occupation. I've written a half dozen books or so, but I've written 3 or 4 on grizzly bears. There's something about grizzly bears.
Well, we're going to talk about those. I do want to talk about them, but if my research is correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you spent 20 years alone and unarmed in Montana,
well, not literally,
Wyoming, and
I hung out with the grizzlies whenever I can, but they have a season, and they hibernate in the winter. They're going to go into hibernation, and then maybe in the next month if we get a big snow. And so, I came in and went out. Now, when I was in the wilderness, basically, and I was working a lot of the time trying to film them, I was usually alone, and that's true. And maybe I'll read you a little passage and tell you why I didn't carry any firearms. Is that okay?
please do. Please do.
Oh, no, it's this one here. Here, this is the first book I wrote. I wrote in a fire lookout up in Glacier National Park. But here's just the
and it's called Grizzly Years. Okay. What year was this that you wrote
it? Late 70s, and I didn't get it published. Anyway, I'm in the same place here. This is just this is just the prelude to the whole damn book. And I ran into, there were a lot of grizzlies around, and sometimes when there's a lot of food and the grizzlies are, packing in like they do up in Alaska for salmon, they form a social hierarchy. And there's one bear that was a big male bear that was really kind of top of this hierarchy, and I ran into him a couple times. I'm just going to take a little sip of water. The big bear stopped 30 feet of me. I slowly worked my hand into my bag and gradually pulled out the magnum. I peered down the gun barrel into the dull red eyes of the huge grizzly. He gnashed his jaws and lowered his ears. The hair on his hump stood up. We stared at each other for what might have been seconds, but felt like hours. I knew once again that I was not going to pull a trigger. My shooting days were over. I lowered the pistol. The giant bear flicked his ears and looked off to the side. I took a step backwards and turned my head towards the trees. I felt something pass between us. The grizzly slowly turned away from me with grace and dignity. and swung into the timber at the end of the meadow. I caught myself breathing heavily again, the flush of blood hot on my face. I felt my life had been touched by enormous power and mystery. I didn't know that the force of that encounter would shape my life for all these decades, but it did. It became full-time work.
And what year again was this life
Oh, it was
changing
very
encounter?
early after I came back from Vietnam. It was really that first year.
Okay, and the book that you're reading from was published in
Well,
1996.
it's been
Grizzly
published.
Years
It, wa-
in
it
Search
was
of the
it
American
was
Wilderness.
I thought it was the late 80s, but they published several versions of this thing. Yeah.
Okay, and is it
You
still
bet.
available if the audience wants to pick it
It's
up?
it was National Geographic did a list of the greatest adventure books of all times, the top 100, and this book is on it. And that includes books by Shackleton and all the great explorers. But that book is on it. I didn't know I could write at the time, but it turns out to be a pretty good book.
Well, congratulations. I will look forward to reading that. The cover should be up on the podcast now. We'll put it up in production, and hopefully the audience will join me in buying that book. So tell us about the book. What were the things that you covered
Well,
in
this
there?
is a book that
It
talked about the nutshell outline was a weary warrior comes back from Vietnam. I couldn't talk to anybody, and I went into the wilderness to sort of heal myself. Ran into grizzlies by accident. You know, I eventually wrote in that book, those grizzlies saved my life. And I also noticed, because I was living in the backcountry, places like Yellowstone, and paying attention, that the grizzlies were having problems of their own. So I became an advocate. And when I started shooting movie footage, um, I had, the only really truly wild grizzly footage, and I did it for 15 years. So I got quite a lot of it. I stalked the grizzlies in true wilderness. I never had anybody generally with me, and, I wouldn't shoot from roads or anything like that. But so that's the way I bargained my way on, big news programs like the Today Show or ABC News or whatever, but I made a lot of stuff. And the way I could get in is, offering my pretty rare footage of grizzly bears for a time to advocate for them. And that turned out to be, the major path of my life. Been a crazy wilderness advocate all my life. Ed Eby was a close friend of mine. I buried him. And, I'm still doing it. I formed a bunch of organizations. Some of them, like,
and we're going to
yeah,
talk about those, but so this was predominantly the 70s and 80s when
yes,
you were
sir.
doing a lot of this filming. Okay. And in 1988, tell me about Peacock's War, which I believe was a combination of
Yeah,
your
that's what it's
Vietnam and
about. It's,
Grizzly experiences.
like the Grizzly years of the story, it's got Vietnam and grizzly bears in it and how they happen to totally mingle in my life. But Peacock's War was the result of, me filming and some people wanted to make a movie of me filming. So it's, it's an hour long. It was a hour long film, and it premiered in the nature slot of PBS in New York, and in Channel 4 over in London. So it's still playing. They're gonna, renew PBS is gonna renew my contract to let them use it this year. So it's still out there. Mainly, I don't know, they showed it all over, but it was on the Discovery Channel and PBS. And it's, the film holds out, but it's about war and wilderness and grizzly bears.
So what are you go to Vietnam, you're there for 2 tours.
No,
Tours were
just
2 years
one,
each?
but that's funny.
Just one. Yeah, so it wasn't a
Just
big
2
deal
years
then.
of my life
But you
getting
served
shot at.
2 years as a Green Beret. Yeah, I was
Right.
being sarcastic, by the way. You served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Green Beret. You had some things you had to work out for yourself and figure out, and the wilderness and spending time with grizzly bears was
Mhm.
the best way for you to do that. You recovered from your malaria, and then you invested your life into these animals. What were you learning from these animals? How did they help you
You
heal?
know, mostly it's a massive lesson in humility because you are not the top dog out there. And that's the one place, that Homo sapiens can go. And in my case, in not much time, you realize you are not the top dog. You're not diddy bopping down a trail, in California or Arizona with a pack on your back and thinking about your portfolio or your girlfriend. There's something out there that, if it wanted to, could kill and eat you, and you got to pay attention. And that is, I find that to be a very healthy way of reasoning and looking at the world, from a point of view that you are not the most important thing out there. And, I've always believed that the emotional posture behind reason was humility. And boy, you can't get it any quicker or better than you can in grizzly country.
And I would imagine, and most of this was in
Yeah, the bulk
Wyoming
of it,
and
just
Montana.
because that's where the bears were. I decided I was gonna make a record of the bears south of Canada. That was my own, there's plenty of bears, not plenty, but there's bears in Canada and Alaska, of course, too. But that meant, Glacier and Yellowstone Park are the reservoirs of there's two populations that are hanging on. And it's not like they're safe. They're not safe, but it's Yellowstone and Glacier National Park. So I filmed in and around those two national parks, and that means Montana and Wyoming, pretty much.
Okay, and are those still the
Yes,
two
sir. Yeah,
strongholds
they
for
are.
grizzlies?
And if it weren't for 90, they'd be a single population, and they should be. One of my projects is
Okay,
getting an underpass
okay.
under 90. But anyway, yeah,
They're not that there are grizzly bears, but I live in South Carolina now, but my home county for 60 years was Ventura County
right.
in Southern California, and they've built a
Well, that's what
massive
we need here.
overpass
You know,
over an 8 lane.
and it's like
Yeah,
pulling teeth
okay,
to
okay.
get the departments of transportation to go for it.
And what is their hesitation?
I,
Why aren't they doing it?
don't know. I've been pioneered that site. I hired biologists to study it back in 2017, and I've been lobbying it ever since. And I've worked with one of my partners and friends is Lance Craighead of the Craighead family, famous grizzly bear biologist. He was in charge. One of the people that did all the biology and the studies. They talked to landowners and took all the pictures and did trail cams and monitored animal casualties on the freeway. But he was here last night, actually, so I stay in touch with those people, and I've founded a couple grizzly bear outfits, and the bears are going to have a lot of trouble. They're really in serious trouble, and I can talk about it if you want me to later.
I do want you to talk about later. I was not this immediate past summer, but the summer before, my wife and I went up
Oh
to
boy.
Jasper National Park in Canada, and we got to see a number of grizzlies while we were up there. And it's 1/100th of a percent of what you went through. But I do remember there was a moment where we were alone on a road, my wife and I, in a car, and there was a fox on the side of the road. And so I quietly let myself out of the car to photograph the fox, beautiful little fox. And I'm taking the pictures of the fox, and I'm back behind the car by the trunk. And as I turn 80 degrees and look across this road, about 20 foot away, there was a mother grizzly with two cubs. And as you mentioned, even people who don't know anything about nature know that a grizzly and cubs is not a positive thing. It's not exactly a house cat with kittens. And I remember turning and looking at that grizzly bear and thinking to myself, to your point about humility, there's absolutely nothing I can do. If I can't possibly get back into the car in time, if that bear decides that I shouldn't be there, we're not going to have a negotiation. And I remember that feeling. I remember the combination of fear and humility and quickly running through my options, none of which seemed real positive. And so I just stood there. I'd like to say I stood there calmly, but I'm sure I peed my pants and was frozen in fear. And eventually, Mom and the cubs decided that I wasn't a threat or wasn't worth crossing the road for, and they backed off into the forest and they were gone. And just a few hours later, my legs started working again, and I could go around and get in the car. And I even have a picture, which I'll throw up. I did manage to snap one picture of this mother grizzly bear staring through, but it was an awe-inspiring moment. I've seen grizzlies before, like in Yellowstone, the way that you do, not the way that you do, but the way regular people do. And, but this was a completely foreign and different, this was like being at the zoo and they suddenly dropped
You're on the
the
same ground with
plexiglass
them.
and this, yeah. And you know what? It was very clear. It was their ground. I wasn't apex anything. If, it was an awe-inspiring thing. And as I'm sharing this with you, I can remember the feeling, all of those emotions that ran through me in that short period of time. So tell us about some of these experiences that you had out there. I mean, you shared the malaria and the tree and whatnot, but obviously you had other
Yeah,
experiences of seeing
yeah.
bears eat or fight with each other, or
Well,
share some of those
there's
with
quite a
us.
lot of it in 20 years, and I'm still go back out every single year. I live in Grizzly country. There's Grizzly tracks down by the Yellowstone River, about a mile away. But the one most people get injured by grizzly bears. It's very uncommon, but it is with mothers defending their young. And I've been in the early days when I was out there, I don't think I was, I wasn't quite as educated as I probably am now. But, you've got to look out for, like during the day, mothers with cubs will bed in, thickets or next to trees, in a thick place near wherever they're feeding. And they really do sack out, and you can get closer than you want to get to a mother with cubs in those situations. I've been charged by grizzlies, almost all mothers with young, uh, you know, almost 3 dozen times, in the low 30s. And over time, I got out of every one. No bears ever touched me, though they've charged up to me, put on the brakes, and stopped. One mother stopped 6 feet away, and she paused for a minute, and she leaned forward as if to smell my pant leg, and then turned around and ran away. But if you are not a threat to your cubs, you're in absolutely no danger. I mean, unless a bear is going so fast, it's going to skid into you, and then you don't fight back. But if you can show that you're not a threat to their cubs, they'll turn around and run away or go away.
And how do you show that you're
First,
not a threat to the cubs?
yeah,
If an 800-pound grizzly
and
bear is charging at you, how do you show that you're not a threat? How do
you
you
don't move
communicate
a
that to the
muscle.
bear?
You're stopping. I turn my head off to the side uh, and look away, because a facial orientation with grizzly bears can be a threat. Okay. And I don't yell or scream. I don't make a sound, and I don't move. Actually, I might eventually talk low to the bear, just a slow, soothing voice. It doesn't matter what you say, I don't think, but I've said a lot. Uh, and every one of those bears had left me alone, and there were a couple subadults which is like a teenage grizzly bear, that made just bluffing charges that I put in there, but the rest of them were mothers. And if you were to scream or run, that bear would, because she doesn't know your intentions, it would probably nail you. How people get hurt, sometimes killed. It's rare, but it's happened.
Is that so? When this happens to you 30 plus times over the course of,
Yeah.
3 or 4 decades, were there any of those where there was a moment where you thought, nope, this is it. This one's not going to stop and smell my blue jeans?
No,
I mean, did that?
the closest I came was that paragraph I read. That bear, I'd seen him fight other bears. I did
Okay.
not know how that was going to turn out. I just knew that I wasn't going to use the pistol, and I never carried a firearm. And when I was, going after grizzlies again, that was a popular wisdom when I was young. We had all these men's magazines, and they said, well, if you're going to be out with bears, you carry a really big piece. That was a popular wisdom. And I found that a gun will get you in more trouble than it'll get you out of in grizzly country.
And this is not to be too graphic, but you
You
were
bet.
trained in the use of firearms. You were. I mean, you have as much familiarity with firearms and their value and their importance in places as anybody else. It's not like you came out of sticking flowers in National Guard rifles at San Francisco rallies. So, it's an interesting thing that a man that was trained that way and had to do that in order to stay alive, I assume, while you were overseas, decided that that wasn't the best way to survive the new life that you had chosen.
The most dangerous critter in the woods is a two-legged one. And if there's nobody in there with a grizz, there's no place I feel safer than, true wilderness. And that's the ideal of grizzly habitat, is true wilderness, because all of the threats to their existence come from people that kill them, humans.
And we had, it was fairly famous, even people that aren't naturalists are probably aware, 22 years ago, Timothy Treadwell, I believe was his name, up in Alaska.
Yeah, when he started out,
him?
he drove out to see me. I was living in Tucson, Arizona, and he kind of wanted my approval. I just told him, the two things he needed to look out for, especially up there. You look out for, I look out for big males during the mating season, which essentially is early June. And, because they fight each other, that's where they get all those scars from. And, it's like breaking up a dog fight. They can just transfer that aggression to you. And the other thing is late in the year, when an abundant food source like salmon suddenly ceased to exist for the bears. And there's really intense competition for what little food habitat is left. And again, it's especially the male grizzlies, but, bears get real aggressive this time of year. Hunting season is about to start here. There's going to be lots and lots of people going into the woods where there are grizzlies. And, it's a dangerous time of year. And Timothy stayed just a week or two too late. He was up in, Katmai on the coast there. He decided to go back in. He was on Kodiak Island, and his girlfriend happened to be the daughter of a guy on the Rain Coast conservation group in British Columbia. And I was on board of that, and so was he. Now, I didn't know this woman, but she died with Timothy, and she didn't have to. And I felt pretty bad about that. Timothy knew what he was doing, and eventually, he stayed too long.
Well, that's I'm sorry that happened, especially to a friend of yours. And as I understand, as I read about it, it was a dispute with the airline and the fees and whatnot. And he said, "The heck with it, I'm going back for another week." And the young woman, I believe her name was Anne, didn't want to go, but didn't have a lot of options.
That's a story, and that's it troubles me too. She was by all ears a wonderful woman.
Well, I'm sorry that happened, but grizzly bear killings are very infrequent, right?
Yes.
Okay. And are grizzly bears huntable? I mean, can you get a license
You
to
can't
hunt a
south
grizzly?
of Canada, but all the states right now, and that's the hottest issue, is the states. There's only 3 states that have any grizzly bears, and that's Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. And all 3 states want a trophy hunt to open, and they're going to try to do it. They're going to take the grizzly bear off the Endangered Species Act. They're going to open up all roadless areas, and up here they're selling off public lands, and the grizzly bears are in a whole lot of trouble. And they want to redefine the term harm, which in the Endangered Species Act includes, if you're going to harm a bear, taking its habitat as harming the bear. They want that changed to exclude habitat, which means they could do anything. A bear on the endangered species list, but you don't protect its habitat. So all those things are, that's why I'm still working. I still have that full-time job.
And is that just to generate revenue, or are they getting political pressure from hunters? I mean, it doesn't sound like grizzly bears should be taken off the endangered species list.
I think it's more, it's political and it's philosophical, and it's really an extension of the notion of dominion, which we Anglos especially have always assumed we have over everything in the West, that we should, be in charge of things, and we decide what to do and with wildlife, we hunt it and, go out and count bears or mallards. And if there's, If we think there's too many of them, we just go out and open a hunting license. And, with grizzly bears have the lowest reproductive rate of any land mammal. I mean, muskox and polar bears are close, but I mean, they have, essentially 2 cubs every 4 or 5 years. That's max. And anyway, it works out to very, very slow reproduction. Unlike wolves and canines who have litters all the time, grizzly bears are very slow to replace themselves.
And so if we allow hunters and they take out a couple of females, it can decimate the
females
population.
Are the most important. Reproductive females are the most important population segment the bears have. And, a female doesn't breed until she's basically 5 years old. And if she has cubs, the average can be 2 or slightly less than 2, but that's about normal. And she keeps those bears with her for, at least 2.5 years, sometimes longer. So the cubs, grow up to be yearlings and 2-year-olds, and they're still learning, where to go and what to eat from their mom. Yeah, and it takes a long time.
How to be a bear.
There.
So how many grizzly bears would you estimate there are in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho?
Certainly less than 2,000. And we've been counting bears as a cottage industry up here, but the counts are not necessarily accurate. They all include, a formula for counting bears you don't see. And for instance, last year, Yellowstone grizzlies, we don't know how many. Some people say 700. That's close. But last year there were 77 killed, and this year the mortality is so high that we're scheduled to exceed that number. And for every bear killing them
What's killing them?
Mainly conflicts with cattle where they're shot, and sometimes sheep. They're killed by cars. The most famous grizzly bear was 399 down in the Tetons, and she was killed. She was killed by a vehicle that's spraying. And they're poached. They're poached and they're shot by mistake by hunters. Mostly hunters who, again, encounter a mother at short range and then not even consider bear spray or doing nothing. They just shoot it. And a lot of bears die like that. When deer elk season opens in within a couple of weeks here, the mortality will go up. It does every time. And that's, you can take out too many in a hurry. The state of Alaska did aerial hunts to manage their bears because they wanted caribou calves to survive, and grizzly bears sometimes eat them. So they sent up, planes and helicopters, and over 17 days shot every bear and wolf they saw. They shot 94 grizzly bears. They're called brown bears up there.
When was this?
Spring, and they also did it this spring. And I don't know how many they got this year. I haven't, I usually write an article about that when it happens, but I haven't gotten all that data yet. But, they did it. And that means that, they shoot cubs, everything. They shot 11 cubs up there, and they run them down with helicopters and blast away, sometimes with shotguns. So that's the state of Montana and Wyoming, the governors thinks that's a good policy. So they want to be able to hunt or remove bears again. They want the authority to go back to the states. Right now, bears are under the endangered species list and federally protected. But that may not last a week with the new, director of the Federal Wildlife Service coming in. He wants to delist the bear and hunt them.
How many grizzlies would you estimate are in
Nobody
Alaska?
knows. An estimate probably is, the best you can do is closer to 30,000. But, we certainly have, and I think it's less than 2,000 south of Canada.
Okay. And then does Canada have a large number of
they don't have
grizzly
an actual
bears?
count on it, but on the coast, British Columbia, of course, that's all the streams are salmon streams, and I did a lot of conservation work up there, especially 30 years ago, back in all through the 90s, and they've got healthy populations of grizzly bears, and it's the same thing. They don't survive in agricultural lands in eastern, like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but they're up in Jasper and in British Columbia and all the Rockies up to Canada.
But they're
Not
protected
necessarily.
in Canada.
They had a real healthy ban on hunting in British Columbia. I think that's been overturned, but the hunters were up there, and as long as there's salmon in the river, the bears are pretty easy to find, really easy, actually.
And so one of the battles that you're still fighting is trying to keep them on the endangered species list and not allow hunting in the 3 states here.
Yeah, that's the
in the
two
continental
main
US.
things.
Okay. And now you mentioned that you had founded a couple of organizations, and Save the Yellowstone Grizzly and the Round River Conservation Studies.
I did. And yeah.
Okay.
And a couple others.
Excuse me.
Well, I was with my friend Doug Seuss and forming Vital Ground, which is the grizzly bear outfit. And lately, a friend of mine talked me into starting the Grizzly Guardians group, and they just got their 501c. I'm probably going to raise money for lawyers, which I haven't done before, but that's where a lot of the stuff is headed. And also,
okay.
I founded a couple other groups too.
Well, if I want to throw something up here for people that might be interested in joining or supporting you, which group
Grizzly
would you prefer
Guardians
that I highlight? Okay, and I can find that grizzlyguardians.com.
I don't think he's got
or
the guy who's going to be the executive. I don't know if he's got his website up yet. That's very recent. They just did the legals.
Okay.
The 501.
Okay. Well, if you can send me that when you get it, I'll throw it up in a future podcast so that we can do that. And we don't have to talk about it if you don't want, but I understand you recently left Save the Yellowstone Grizzly.
Yeah, I did.
And we certainly don't have to discuss it if you don't want to, but if there's something you want to share, please do.
I worked with Lance Craighead on that underpass, which we're still fighting for. Although I'm associated with cutting down billboards, I put up during the fight for delisting, I put up 5 billboards on this where I live and up on I-90. And eventually I had to get some outside support for the grizzly bears. So I took out a full page ad in the New York Times, last year, about a year ago, September 20th last year. And the Federal Wildlife Service kept the bears on the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of the write-in letters came from people who read the New York Times in the East, so it's not just a Rocky Mountain segment that gets to decide. But that's all changed with this new administration, of course.
Yeah, unfortunately. Now we've talked about I do want to talk about a couple of movies and another book. But over the years, I lived in California forever. There was always talk about reintroducing grizzly bears into California. Is that Oregon, Washington, California? Is that a possibility in the future?
Well,
is anything happening there?
There's a lot of talk about it. And the fact that people in California are willing to give that experiment a roll is probably the biggest thing. The other problem is, where do you get extra grizzlies? Grizzlies spend a long time learning a home range and a habitat, a long time. And, arguably there aren't any extra grizzlies in a place like Yellowstone or Glacier. They would probably look in British Columbia. But again, you've got you've got the ethical problem. Is it, correct to take a well-adjusted grizzly bear with a known home range and habitats, just rip him out of there and drop him in a place like California that he's never seen before? There's plenty of grizzly food in California. It's just it's the human conflicts that have to be solved. And if human beings are willing to tolerate grizzlies eventually get along, cattle killing is pretty rare. Not very many bears take up, even though they're kind of easy prey. And, if you can do lots of things to protect your chicken coop or whatever, there's electric fences, there's dogs that work, and, lots of stuff. We don't secure our food very well around here. Still, grizzlies getting in the garbage within 30 miles of here, up in Gardner, Montana.
Okay. Yeah, I've spent some time in Gardner. The last, I think, 5 winters I've been there and gone into Yellowstone in the winter.
Oh,
I
it's
love
great.
Yellowstone in the winter. This year I don't get to go, although I'll be in Montana, but I'm going up to Glacier instead of Yellowstone because I'm going to be studying long-eared owls with a gentleman named Denver Holt up
Oh,
in
no, okay, that's
outside of
interesting.
Kalispell. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, that wipes out my Yellowstone trip for the
Right
winter.
now,
I hate to
Glacier's
miss it, but
beautiful. I
it's
just
such an
got back from
opportunity.
Glacier on the east side, all the aspens are in
Okay.
perfect color. So get up there.
I can't wait to get there. I love it.
Yeah.
Backing up to California, so with the challenges that would be involved, would you be an advocate of trying
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, we'd
of
have to
bringing some
solve.
grizzlies?
Yeah,
Would
because
you
there's
support
enough,
that?
mother grizzlies they could work out a halfway house for grizzlies. Mother grizzlies get killed a lot by people carrying firearms. They've already been, I don't know what, a dozen this year. During hunting season, that number goes up a lot. And their cubs, they don't know what to do with the cubs. Sometimes they just euthanize them. And there aren't many places to take grizzly bear cubs, but that's not a very expensive experiment. Lots of individuals have tried it, kind of raising bears, in the semi-wild and then releasing them. That's worked for other animals. Yes.
Okay, so you think it's a possibility, and if it's done right,
Yeah.
it might very well be worth doing. Okay, all right. Tell me about and Grizzly Country. Apparently, this was your turn as a movie star.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm trying to
Were you in
remember.
were
Grizzly
you in a
Country
movie?
was sort of a short film. Yeah. And it was,
Yes.
well,
So tell us
it was
about it.
somebody else's idea. One of my sister's friends, no, is that right? No. One of my daughter's friends worked for Peter Daring, who does this outdoor equipment place. It's called Peak, and she
Mhm.
talked to him, and they decided before they had even met me that they wanted to make this film. And they hired a great director, and he came on out and we shot a little footage, and he made it beautiful. It's not very long, 11, 12 minutes or something like that. But it's a very good introduction to me and how I feel about the bears. And I show it sometimes when I lecture, just as an introduction. But that's a beautiful film. I thank those guys a lot.
Okay.
And he's the same,
Well,
Peter
that's
Daring's
great.
the same guy that financed paying my biologist to study the road underpass. So he's been a great help.
Okay. Okay, congratulations and thank you. In 2021, there was another film called The Beast of Our Time, Grizzly
Right.
Bears
I
and Climate
produced that,
Change.
wrote, most of the dialogue and did a little bit of editing on that film. But that's what I've been writing about for more than 20 years is, climate change is it's the biggest deal we're dealing with, and we ignore it at our peril because it's going to happen no matter how much governments and people ignore it. It's happening all over, and a lot of species are going to go extinct, and a lot of things are going to die, including Homo sapiens. We've never experienced the kind of heat that they predict by the end of this century, which is like hotter than Homo sapiens have ever been in the history of our species. That's a gamble. That's like Russian roulette. We haven't tried that yet.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like there's more than one
Yeah.
bullet in one chamber,
Oh
too.
my God. Yeah. Yes, you're right. You're right.
It's so is climate change currently
I
impacting
believe so,
the grizzly
because grizzly
bears?
bears are, we're finding them wandering more than they ever have before. We find them going out on the high plains, for instance, out of the east of the mountains and out there. And obviously what they're doing is they're looking for food. And, to wander out of their sanctuaries and national parks means, they're exposed to danger from human beings. Human beings don't know anything about grizzlies, and we tend to fear what we are ignorant of. And I think eventually we hate what we fear. And that's why a lot of people are, adversely have adverse attitudes towards grizzly.
And so what are the changes that you're seeing? When we talk
Right.
about climate change and we talk about, let's say,
Right.
the Tetons in Yellowstone, What specifically are we talking about? What's happening there that's motivating or driving or forcing the grizzlies to move?
Okay, the biggest thing is the death of white bark pine. Now, white bark pine grows at the very tops of tree lines in Yellowstone, Tetons, Wind River Range, all of our mountains. The white bark pine is a stone pine that has a very nutritious nut. So on years when there's good cones, the squirrels cast your cones on the ground, the grizzlies dig them up and eat them. And it turned out that was the most important food source for mothers and their young. It was incredibly nutritious. They eat it in the fall, this time of year, when there's hunting season, that keeps them, safe from hunters because they're way the hell up high. And, it was a primary food for this time of year for especially females with cubs in Yellowstone. Back starting in 2002, the winter temperatures quit, dropping into, like 35 below zero. Just year after year, they got a little warm. And by 2007, there's an endemic bug, pine beetle, and the larva of that thing could overwinter up high in the younger white bark pine. And it did. In 10 years, we lost them. You could look at the tops of all the mountains around here. They're up to 11, 12,000 feet. And they turn red because all of the white bark pine tree that are at the top of the timber on the mountains turned red. They were dead. And they're not coming back. That's one thing. But just the fact of...
Well, so as a result, part of the trickle-down problem then is the squirrels aren't hiding the cones, the bears don't get their fall buffet, and so they've got to go
Yes,
to
sir.
other places to try to find it. And to your point earlier, they're going to habitats and locations they may not be familiar with, perhaps aren't perfectly suited for as they have been to this.
If we left them alone and tolerate them, they could probably make it, because a grizzly bear is a very adaptable omnivore. It can find food almost anywhere. I mean, before we killed off all the bison and decimated the tribes, they were all the way, across the plains to the Mississippi River, basically. And, any place you could find a buffalo, you could find a wolf. And if you can find a wolf, you can find a grizzly bear. And of course, now we've got just a couple enclaves of grizzlies living in the high Rocky Mountains and mainly surviving because there's national parks.
Okay. Well, not terribly positive, but it's good to have men like you, men and women out there battling for this. Shifting gears a little bit, there is a novel out there called The Monkey Wrench Gang, written by Edward Abbey, who I believe you mentioned a little earlier. And if I understand right, the protagonist in that book was based on you?
Here, I wrote the introduction.
Oh, there you go.
The story's there.
Okay.
Read this book. It's as relevant, today as 50 years ago. I did write the introduction, but that's because, I was part of the story, or at least the inspiration for the story. It's a good book.
Well, and not everybody gets to say that they've inspired movies and books and whatnot. So congratulations to you for some of that work that you've done over the last 40 years being recognized. So tell me about the future. What's next for you? What's next for grizzly bears? You've mentioned the underpass and trying to keep the bears on the endangered species list and bringing back the hunting. Tell me where you are and what you're doing.
Well, I'd hate to live in a world without grizzly bears, and having them just in Canada or Alaska isn't quite good enough. So I'll continue that fight. And I'm a geezer now, and that'll keep me pretty busy. But, the great threats are like climate change, and I'll keep writing and lecturing about that. I'm still writing. I'm still writing. I didn't think I'd be around long enough to finish another book. That was 3 years ago, so I was wrong about that too. So I'll keep pushing that stone up the mountain. A grizzly bear is just, it's worth trying to save, because first of all, their habitat has to be close to wilderness. They really can't tolerate human beings who are intolerant and, with roads and things like that and livestock. And also, it's the one thing that reminds us arrogant Homo sapiens, especially in this country, that, We're not necessarily in charge of everything we do and every place we go. And I think that's a very healthy relationship, to be able to go out in the woods and look over your shoulder pretty carefully.
It's going to surprise a lot of people to find out that we're not in charge.
Well,
there's a lot of people that believe we are. I've got a guest coming up in about a week.
What's that?
I've got a guest coming up in about a week named Christine Webb, and she's just released a book called The Arrogant Ape.
You got it.
And that book is about you and I. It's about Homo sapiens. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's, no, wait a minute. There are other things in the world besides us. And those things weren't necessarily just put there to feed us or entertain us, or if they bother us, to be eliminated. That maybe we ought to respect that we are an integral part of an overall web, and not the apex of everything. And I think for a lot of people who live in the comfort of their, suburban tract house out in Riverside, California, they just imagine that we are, that, Yellowstone is just a big old zoo, and you go up there and you see a couple of things, and that's fun. And you watch these clowns on the roads getting out and trying to pet an elk during rut, or, pet a bison. And I find myself rooting for the animals. I don't know. I would like to think that the impact that you and others are having, some of the other people I've had on this show, is going to make a difference. And, if we can get through these next 3 years without having our national parks closed and whatnot, then maybe we've got a fighting chance. Well, I guess we'll wait and see. But I want to thank you for being on the show. I want to thank you for the work you've done with the Grizzlies and continue to do. I want to thank you once again for your time as a Green Beret and serving in Vietnam. And I'm going to throw my email up here. If anybody's got questions for me, please send them to me. If you've got questions for Doug, send them to me and I'll forward them on. If he doesn't have time to answer, you can blame me. But if he does, great. And Doug, I had mentioned to you, I'd love for you to recommend a book for the audience to read, something nature-based that you think would be important.
The last words I heard was, you'd love something.
We may have lost Doug here. If we have, I'll get the book from him another time, and I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and throw up our, if you're watching this on YouTube, hopefully we'll get Doug back, but if you're watching this on YouTube, and
I'm back.
Are you back, Doug?
I can hear you too.
Okay, great. Let's back up and let's see if you can recommend a book for the audience that they would like, something nature-based.
Oh my gosh, I have to hawk my own wares. This is the last book I wrote. And that's me in polar bear country carrying a spear because I wouldn't carry a gun.
I'll put a better picture of it up there, but what is the name of the book?
Was it worth it? Yeah.
Was it worth it? Okay. All right. Well, we'll definitely throw that up there and recommend that to the audience. Do you have a book also that you haven't written?
Yeah. You
might want to share with the audience to recommend it.
The last book was A Walk in the Park by a person who's passionate about the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. That's a very fine book. It was also a book of the year. Let's see, last year. And the book I just showed you, Was It Worth It? Was the outdoor book of the year, I think in 22 or 23, one of those years. It also got an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters.
Okay. Well, we'll put them both.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations, and that's fantastic. We'll put them both up there because the audience has a lot of voracious readers in it, and that'll be great. I'm also going to throw up and remind, if you're watching this on YouTube, really appreciate if you would subscribe. The more people that we get to subscribe, throw down a comment or click like, the more people we can get the message, the one that Doug's been sharing for the last hour, out to the public. And frankly, the more guests we can get. So that's pretty cool. Doug, at the end of every podcast, I do a little segment. I call it Field Notes, and it's about an animal or a bird or a park or whatever. Clearly today, my Field Notes is going to be on grizzly bears. That's got to be the one. So you can watch that when I'm done with it and critique it for me. And I do want to say thank you again for everything, for your service, for the bears, for your work, for your conservation, and for sounding the alarm. Thank you, sir. And as I wrap up every show, I like to tell the guests and the audience to stay safe, which seems particularly important with you, to stay safe and to stay curious. You guys all have a great day. Doug, thanks again. Everybody enjoy. Hello and welcome to the 26th edition of Field Notes. This is going to be a good one. It's going to be on grizzly bears, and I appreciate you listening. Grizzly bears it's kind of like killer whales. You say grizzly bear and people's heads turn. They're pretty cool animals. They're amazing to see in the wild, and I think we're going to have some fun learning a little bit about them today, and I do appreciate you listening. This Field Notes is following a podcast from Doug Peacock, who has spent 40 years off and on living with grizzly bears. So if you haven't seen that podcast, go ahead and do that, number 26 with Doug Peacock. But the Field Notes will stand alone on grizzly bears, so we're going to dive right into this thing and talk about some of the stuff that makes grizzly bears so cool. Grizzly bears are a subspecies of brown bear. So the easiest way to put that is that all grizzly bears are brown bears, but not all brown bears are grizzly bears. It's kind of like whiskeys and bourbons. All bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. So the grizzly bear stands alone. And as part of the brown bear family, the coastal brown bears are much bigger than the grizzly bears. In large part, that's because their diet consists of salmon, and salmon just fattens these little dickens up, and they stay fat year round. So I had a chance to see some brown bears this summer. My wife and I were in Alaska on a National Geographic vessel, and we got up, not dangerously close, but we got up to where we could see them pretty well. They are impressive animals, but so are grizzly bears. And grizzly bears are the ultimate omnivore. They'll eat berries, they eat roots, they eat moose calves, they eat carrion, and they eat moths. I never thought about a grizzly bear eating a moth, but in Yellowstone, an adult grizzly bear will eat up to 40,000 army cutworm moths per day. That is a lot of moths. It seems counterproductive to me. It doesn't seem like the energy and the protein it would get from a moth would make it worth chewing. But obviously it is 40,000 times a day. Now, grizzly bears used to have a much bigger range than they do now. It was thought that they went as far east as Minnesota and all the way to the West Coast, and then throughout the western half of Canada and up into Alaska. Now, they are still in Alaska, and they are still in Western Canada. In Alaska, there are roughly 30,000 grizzly bears, is the estimate. And in Western Canada, the estimate is 25,000. Here in the States, they are predominantly, maybe even exclusively, there's some talk they might be in Washington, but Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, and centered up in that Grand Teton, Yellowstone, that iconic idea of seeing a grizzly bear in Yellowstone, which, by the way, I have seen, and if you haven't, you got to get up there and do it because it's pretty amazing. But south of Canada, so again, those three states, the Wyoming, Montana, Idaho trio, if you will, there are roughly 2,000 grizzly bears, which doesn't sound like a lot compared to what it used to be decades or even centuries ago. However, it's up quite a bit from the 1970s when we were down to maybe 400 grizzly bears. So some of the protection efforts that people like Doug Peacock and others are doing are paying off, and grizzly bears are expanding their numbers and a little bit their habitat and their range. So that's fantastic. When you think about a grizzly bear, think about 4-inch razor-sharp claws. These are unbelievably strong animals. Now, grizzly bears primarily use their claws for digging roots and flipping over rocks when they're looking for grubs and bugs and insects and things to eat. They're not really climbers, whereas their cousins, the black bears, are climbers. And we have black bears all over. I've seen black bears in a half dozen different states in the last year and up into Canada as well. The black bears are smaller, they're black, and they climb. Oh, they are different. Now, the grizzly bears are typically in the 400 to 700 pound range, although they can weigh up to 1,200. That's very infrequent. Whereas the brown bears, the ones out on the coast that are eating all the salmon, they get up over 1,000 pounds routinely. Now, this is amazing. Grizzly bears can sprint for a short distance up to 30 to 35 miles an hour. Now, to give you an idea, the fastest human beings in the world, and these are the premier sprinters, run about 22, 23 miles an hour. 30 to 35 miles an hour is faster than a racehorse. They can't do it for long, but they can do it for long enough to catch us. So this leads me back to Doug Peacock, the gentleman I mentioned that we did the podcast on. Doug has been charged by grizzly bears more than 30 times and has survived all of those and not suffered an injury as a result. And it was only in the very first one where he carried a gun. It's not that he's afraid of guns. The man's Green Beret, served 2 tours in Vietnam, but he's determined that it's not a good idea to do so, so he doesn't. What he says is that when a bear charges him, he stands still, He stays quiet and he does not look the bear directly in the eye. He turns his head to one side or the other so the bear does not think that it's being challenged. Bears are thought to hibernate by most people. They actually don't, but they almost hibernate. Their heart rate drops from 40 beats a minute down to 8 beats a minute. And for 7 straight months, they do not eat, they do not drink, they do not urinate, they do not defecate. They will have babies, however, during that time. And a newborn grizzly is the size of a chipmunk. I did not know that until I began doing research for this field notes, that they are that tiny. They weigh less than a pound when they're born. They're just shrimps. I just thought they would be so much bigger than that. Of course, they grow quickly, and they also stay with mom for 2 or 3 years. They do have instincts, but they need training. They need teaching. And it's important for the mothers to do that. So they do. They keep their cubs around for a while. And by the way, it's a quote unquote old wives' tale that you don't want to get between a mother bear and her cubs, but you really don't. It's an old wives' tale that has not just a smattering of truth, it is completely true. It's just not a smart thing to do. They've been on the endangered species list since 1975. There are changes going on in that world now in both directions. There is some movement afoot up in the Wyoming and Montana and Idaho areas to start allowing hunting of grizzly bears again. We've only got about 2,000 up there. It doesn't seem bright to me, but some hunters, of course, are great. Some hunters are conscientious and whatnot, but grizzly bears are a trophy animal if they go after them, and we just don't have enough. I don't know that we ever will, but we don't now. There are some other positive things going on. The Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, which is an idea of setting up all the way from Yellowstone National Park to over 1,000 miles away up in the Yukon in Canada, to set up a corridor where non-flight birds can migrate. So antelope and wolves and coyotes and bears. And actually there's an organization called Yellowstone to Yukon, Y2Y, I'm sorry. Jody Hilty runs that, and she's going to be a guest here on the show coming up in a couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that. I've had the opportunity to see grizzly bears in the wild. I've seen them in Yellowstone, and 2 summers ago, my wife and I were up in Jasper National Park, and we saw probably a total of about a half dozen. The closest one was about 20 feet away, which was far too close for me. That is one scary animal, but it was incredible to see it. And I'll throw a photo up there. We'll have some fun with that. Hey, if you're watching this thing on YouTube, if you're listening to it on Apple or Spotify or anything else, great, and thank you, much appreciated. If you're watching on YouTube, take a moment and subscribe. We're trying to add subscribers, and that allows us to reach more people with the message and about nature and naturalists and birders and rangers and all kinds of things. And it also allows us to get and bring in more guests, which is what we're trying to do. So do me a favor, just click subscribe, maybe drop a comment or hit like if you have a comment, or if you did like it, I'd appreciate it. And I hope that you enjoyed this field notes. They're one of my favorite things to do with regards to this podcast project. And as I like to wrap up every single time, when you're out in nature, and I hope you are as often as you possibly can, stay safe and stay curious. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. And when you get a chance, man, go see a grizzly bear.